I can say good morning, but it's actually good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we now have attendees throughout the United States and even around, which is a real step forward for us. Over the last decade and a half, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library has been putting on programs on a variety of topics, such as political economy, capitalism, socialism, communism, supporting the struggles of the working class, the fight against imperialism, militarism, and war, in support of the environmental movement and the fight for racial and gender justice. We have consciously, and I hope successfully, cultivated a culture of mutual respect and the understanding that we do not necessarily agree on all matters. Rather, this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed here are those of the participants, and they do not represent the ICSS or the Marxist Library necessarily. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is from Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Our speaker today is the noted Marxist political economist, Michael Roberts, who is joining us from London, England. He will be speaking on the story of the year, COVID, but what now for the economy in 2021. And this is going to be a great session, a really interesting session. I just want to start off by saying a couple of things. Michael blogs at thenextrecession.wordpress.com. I think he's been blogging for over a decade there. And I have to say that it is the best economics website on the World Wide Web. If you really want to get up-to-date analysis and about what's really going on in the economy, breaking through all of the noise in the mainstream capitalist media and business press, follow Michael on his blog. Every one of his posts are just terrific. He's also an author, and his most recent book is Angles 200, his contribution to political economy, which is also available on his, a link is on his blog to get the book. So with that being said, let me just say a little bit about the session, how it's going to be conducted. Our speaker will have about an hour for his presentation, during which time attendees will be muted. If you need anything, you can always communicate to the moderator or Mehmet, who will be doing the technical backup via chat, Zoom chat. After the presentation, we'll have a short break for announcements, followed by about an hour of question and answers moderated by myself. If you have any questions during the Q&A, you can raise your hand through the participant, and we will call on you in the order in which you've raised your hand. And we will have 2 minutes for each question and comment. So please be respectful to the group, speaker, and moderator. So without further ado, let's go over to Michael, and please go ahead and get started.
Well, comrades and everybody who is attending, thanks very much for inviting me to present to you. It's an appropriate moment as we've got through the first year of the COVID pandemic, this plague that has hit the world. And it's a good time to review what has happened in the last year, and also to consider what's likely to take place over this year, 2021, and also beyond. So what I'm going to do now in a series of graphs is first of all to show you where we are, what happened with the COVID and its impact both on health and on the economy, where the COVID came from and why it's hit humanity at this particular time. Then to look at the question of where we're going in 2021, what sort of recovery is possible both in health and the economy, and also finally to look at some of the long-term challenges facing the capitalist economy and working people as we go beyond recovery of the pandemic, and how we're going to have to reset the economy and how that should be reset after the pandemic. To do that, I'm going to try and share some graphs. So if you'll bear with me, I'll just find the right ones. So, year of the COVID, and what next? Let me start by telling you exactly where we are right now. This is the very latest figures as of done yesterday, as far as I can see, from the official sources or the collated sources. And you can see on the left-hand side of this graph that we now have daily cases hitting over 800,000 a day worldwide at the moment. Altogether, there have been 90 million people who have been confirmed as being infected by the COVID-19 virus, and that has contributed to nearly 2 million deaths as we stand at the moment. As I'll go in a bit further, we can see whether that would have been worse, but that's the situation at the moment. And on the right-hand side of this screen, you can see that daily deaths now are also reaching something like 15,000 a day. I think that figure shows a day. And remember, we can see just looking at that graph, those two graphs, that we are at the peak and continually rising level for this COVID virus. Contrary to the hopes back in April and May that the worst was over and we will be able to, during the summer, get control of the virus, we've seen a dramatic increase in the autumn and winter period. And both in the US and in Europe, the situation continues to accelerate rather than improve. In fact, weekly cases are now at record highs. This is the very latest figures from the World Bank, who released them only 2 days ago. The advanced economies are hitting these sort of levels. You can see about 400,000 or 350,000 weekly cases. And in the so-called global south, which World Bank likes to call emerging market and developing economies, EMDES, we can see that we're nearly hitting 400,000 every week. And that is the very, and you can see by looking at that graph that the process of acceleration is taking place. The US and Europe are the global leaders in the deaths that have taken place per million of population. This graph adjusts for the number of people in each country. So it's deaths per million, the mortality rates. And you can see that over in across the pond in the UK, we're right up there in the top, and it's getting worse. The US is close behind, and some of the other European countries. Note, however, right down the bottom here, you can see that the Asian countries, and in particular China, have hardly registered a huge amount of deaths as a result of COVID. And even in Europe, Germany is relatively low. We're going to come back to why that is the case in the course of this presentation. But why COVID? Why has it happened in 2020? Are there any reasons for it? Now, the mainstream press and others often say, well, this is like, just comes out of the blue. It's like an asteroid hitting the Earth and wiping out the dinosaurs. It's completely chance that this plague should hit us. And there was nothing that we could have expected about it. We couldn't have forecast it was going to happen. It's often called a black swan or a white swan, but usually a black swan. And if you remember, that is the phrase a lot of statisticians use for a completely unexpected event, or those of us who remember Donald Rumsfeld's phrase, the unknown unknown, that you just cannot expect, you don't know what it's going to be, just as you couldn't predict that there were swans that weren't white until you got to Australia and you saw black swans. So you couldn't predict that this virus would hit the world in the way that it has done. Well, I don't think the evidence stacks up to that. Let's just look at the number of epidemics or pandemics from new pathogens that have hit humanity have developed over the last 20 or 30 years. SARS, MERS, and other forms of SARS, and now, of course, the COVID-19. And what is clear, that we've had a growth in the number of pathogens coming into humanity for which we are not immune, and for which we have no vaccines or any method of dealing with it medically, at least up to now. And what is the reason for that? The reason appears to be that these pathogens, which have been around for thousands of years, locked into the various bodies of rather remote animals, particularly bats, but also other animals that don't come into contact with human beings on a great scale, particularly in the more remote parts of the world. These pathogens have been sitting there for ages, but they've seeped through into farm animals, into the farming activities across the world, and then from farm animals into the food markets of humanity. And why is that? It's because there's been a rapacious expansion of capitalist production across the world, so that virtually every part of the world now is being used and utilized in order to find increased fossil fuel production and exploration, mining exploration, timber and logging, urbanization in general, industrial farming. This completely uncontrolled development of production by capitalism searching for profit across the world has brought us into contact with these pathogens that have been locked away for thousands of years. And now we're getting a series of epidemics as a result of these spreading into humanity. Been a number of excellent socialists, epidemiologists, and virologists who've been explaining this. I recommend Rob Wallace's book, Big Food, Big Farms, and Mike Davis has also done work. Mike Davis, I believe, San Diego, California, has done excellent work on showing how the connection between the development of capitalism and the spread of these epidemics. So this really isn't a surprise. This really isn't a shot out of the sky. This was a process that was inevitably going to happen. In fact, even the United Nations was well aware of the serious dangers, and UN scientists and others have organized on what they call a global pandemic monitoring board. On a regular basis, they've been looking to see whether we should be prepared for such pandemics. And only in September 2019, just before the pandemic hit us, they said we can expect a serious pandemic shortly, and really there's no preparation. It's hampered by a lack of political will at all levels. Although national leaders respond to health crisis when it's already there, they do not devote any energy or resources to keeping outbreaks from escalating into disasters. And they warned back in September that this was going to happen. But of course, nothing was done. The attitude of most governments was to spend money on prevention or protection in advance for such pandemics was a waste of money. They only hurt poor people in the global south. It wasn't going to be an issue. And when far from wanting to spend money on health, they were looking to cut back on that. At the same time, there's been no real capitalist medical research into dealing with these pandemics. Big pharmaceutical companies around the world do little research, or have done up to now, in the development of new antibiotics and antivirals. Of the 18 largest US pharma companies, only 3 have done any work at all on vaccines and other such antiviral products. 15 don't do anything at all. Why is that? Because heart medicines, tranquilizers, treatments for people in the global north, in so-called affluent areas, are much more profitable, and also because they can be repeated through addiction. And there's no real profit in looking for defenses against hospital infections, emergent diseases, or tropical killers. And yet we've got a universal vaccine for influenza, that is to say, a vaccine that targets the immune parts of the influenza virus proteins. It's been a possibility for decades, but we do not have a universal vaccine because we do not spend the money to research it. So every year there has to be a new vaccine which doesn't cover sufficiently the population, even on the influenza basis. So it's not profitable. So the main reason that capitalist science and companies who control capitalist science have not spent any money on this is because it's not profitable. That doesn't mean to say that the public sector hasn't got great scientists, as would prove to be the case, in coming forward delivering a vaccine in various forms and varieties over the last few months in a record period of time. But this could have been avoided if we'd done the research, the preparation, and the development of antivirals for such emergent diseases. And it's not just big pharma, but we know, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a dramatic cutback in spending on health and public services to protect and improve the health of the population. In the US, life expectancy is actually falling at the moment. And also the cutbacks that have taken place, not just in the US, but across Europe. And of course, in the global South, there's just enough resources devoted in these areas have meant that the hospital and health system was totally incapable and under-resourced to meet this pandemic. It was working efficiently at 99% of capacity because capacity had been reduced and had no room for the expansion of capacity when the pandemic came. And you can see, looking at this graph, we can see up here on the left-hand side that we've got Japan, Korea, and Germany, if you might say, with the best ratios of hospital beds per thousand, although that's fallen over the last 20 years. And it's no surprise that those countries are the ones that have dealt better medically with handling this pandemic. And then if we search down here, we can find even China has a reasonably middle of the road level of hospital beds per thousand. And look where we are down here. The US is down here near the bottom of the league in hospital beds 2000. And of course, in Europe, where there's been the biggest disaster as well, it's really quite low. Even the so-called socialist Scandinavian countries have seen a neoliberal cutback in health spending. There's Denmark, there's Sweden, it's Finland and Norway middling. So we've seen this general policy adopted of cutting back on the need for proper health systems that can be robust and defend us against these new diseases. So a combination of capitalist exploration, searching for profit, driving in as humanity into the direction of new pathogens, the failure to do any research and protect us and advance in advanced warning, to develop antiviral medicines to defend us, and the lack of any real, robust, and sufficiently large health system to handle the crisis when it hits us. And let me remind everybody, out there's a lot of talk amongst the minority that COVID-19 was a hoax. It was an over emotional response to just an ordinary virus that is no worse than flu. Well, the evidence has shown that that is not the case 1 year later. But even if we look at the comparison between flu and COVID-19, we can see there's a big difference. The infection rate, which is the RO number, with flu is about 1.3, so slightly more than one person infected by another person. But in the case of COVID, that could be 2 or 3 times the rate of infection. The incubation time for flu is on average about 4 days. So if you don't infect anybody else, the symptoms go away, you're no longer infected or likely to infect anybody else after 4 days. In the case of COVID, it can last 14 days, as far as we can tell, certainly 7, so that the likelihood of spreading of the infection is greatly increased. The amount of people who end up in hospital because of flu is about 2% of total cases, quite small indeed. In the case of COVID, it's up to around about 20% of people. And a case fatality rate, that's the number of people who actually die as a result of being infected by flu, is 0.1%, 0.1% for flu. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Case of flu, it's 0.1%. In the case of COVID-19, it's 1 to 3.4%, quite a significantly larger amount. And now I'm going to show you a figure that I worked out myself only recently. This is the infection fatality rate. That's different from the number of people who die who have been confirmed as having got COVID-19. This is an estimate of the number of people who have been infected around the world and the amount of deaths relative to that. That's quite important because clearly a lot more people have been infected than have been confirmed as cases going to doctors or hospitals. In fact, probably as much as 10 times more may be the case. But if we fill that in, the number of extra people who have probably been infected with no symptoms or not reported to doctors or hospitals as a result, then we get an interesting figure, which shows at the beginning of this, most epidemiologists who looked at it closely thought that COVID would end up with an infection fatality rate of about 0.6 to 1%. While flu, as you can see, is now the 0.01, a maximum of 0.1 on the infection fatality rate. The world rate appears to be only slightly above the flu rate, but when you look at some of the countries, the major countries around the world, the reason that's so low is because the vast majority of the population doesn't live in the northern hemisphere, but in the southern hemisphere. And as yet, because of dispersal, because they're young, we don't really know how many people have been infected. But when we look into the areas around Northern Europe, Latin America, and other countries like that, we're getting figures pretty much close to what was expected by the epidemiologists and virologists at the beginning of this. So what this tells us, and this is what the point is, that COVID-19 is at least 6 times more deadly than annual flu, possibly more. And it is not only that, it not only leads to a much higher death rate, but it also leads a whole load of people, something like 20%, with serious conditions as a result of COVID. There is now the new medical complaint called long COVID, where people are left with lasting and permanent damages to their lungs, heart, and other things, which could last for months or even longer, as far as we know. That doesn't really happen with flu. This is a new phenomenon which is going to leave a lot of people debilitated and so on. The usual argument presented against the idea that COVID is more dangerous is it's only affecting people over 70, over 80, or people who've already got other underlying illnesses. Well, my reply is twofold to that. First of all, thanks very much. I didn't know that because I'm over 70, you can write me off, it doesn't really matter. I've had a good run and I'm not entitled to perhaps maybe 10 or 15 years more I've got left in my life in reasonable condition. I should just accept that it's bad luck, but I've got knocked out by COVID. We're certainly not going to stop working, producing and making profits just to keep you alive. And also that applies to the sick and the poor, who most people who have caught this tend to be severely poor because they're also unhealthy, because they're poor. It's all combined together. And so they too could be culled out of this. So the Malthusian solution of a better capitalist economy after this would be to cull all the old people, cull all the sick people, and on that basis we'll have a much more productive young economy to go for. Well, I don't think we should accept that both morally, but also I'm not sure that that does deliver better productivity if we wipe out a whole section of the population with their experience and skills and so on. So that is the situation that we've reached. That's at the height of this pandemic at the moment, plus the explanation, in my view, about why we've had this pandemic. And that, of course, implies that we could have future pathogen pandemics down the road, unless something is done to deal with this. But what has happened as a result of that impact of that pandemic? Well, because health systems weren't coping, there was no test and trace, there was no sufficient hospital facilities, governments were forced to either let things rip. If no government had done anything across the world, we estimate something like 50 to 60 million people would have died by now. But governments were forced to act. So they had the only thing they could do, because they didn't have any other preventative facilities at a sufficient rate, apart from a few countries, was to impose lockdowns of varying degrees of depth and restrictiveness. In the case of China, New Zealand, Taiwan, Korea, it was a severe lockdown combined with mass test and tracing, blocking of the borders, locking down areas in order to try to eliminate and suppress the virus. In the case of most of Europe, United States, Mexico and other areas, it was pretty free and go, sometimes lockdown, sometimes not. The result, of course, was a much higher level of death rate and illness as a result. But everywhere, lockdown was applied at some degree. And in addition to that, not just government lockdown, but everybody started to socially isolate, to not travel, to not go out so much, to not spend money in the same way, which would bring them into contact with other people in leisure facilities and so on. So there was a voluntary lockdown by millions of people around the world. And that, of course, has led to a dramatic collapse in production and spending across the world in the major economies. This is the worst slump since capitalism really was an industrial capitalist economy in 150 years. If you look at this graph just released by the World Bank, you can see that the 1980s recession, which many of us remember, in the US, or globally, sorry, fell by nearly 3%. The famous simultaneous international recession after 1973-4, the oil crisis, around 3%. The 1957 recession, just at the end of the Korean War, we saw a recession of around 3%. The global financial crash, which was the Great Recession of 2008-9, about 4%. But look, COVID-19 in 2020 has led to a global reduction in production, global, of 9%. That is a staggeringly large figure that has not been matched by anything for the last 150 years, at least. And it's not just the depth of this slump, but it's also gone everywhere. Up here is a measure of the the percentage of countries that have gone into recession as a result of COVID. Going way back to 1870, the last 150 years, you can see that 93% of countries around the world, economies around the world, have gone into a slump as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. Nothing compares with that, not even the Great Recession in the breadth of how this recession has hit the world. And the Great Recession itself, around 60% is still well short, and that was really a well-spread global slump for capitalism. So we have the deepest slump and the widest slump that capitalism has seen in 150 years. And this slump is everywhere. In the world, we can see, as I say, we've got a fall of about 9%. The very latest figures from the Global Bank show that there is not much difference in terms of the drop, both for the advanced countries and for the global south. It's all around about this figure. Of course, for the global south, the impact of that is way, way worse, as I will explain shortly. And what does that mean? That slump is not just a statistic. It means that millions of people have been put out of work, possibly permanently, probably permanently for millions of them, and have been forced to stay at home, unable to get an income. Of course, in various countries, there has been some support for people forced to work at home or furloughed or unable to continue their jobs, which we'll come to in a minute. But you can see, if we look at these figures, at least to the beginning of first half of 2020, that the fall in employment across the board in various countries was anything between 15% in Japan, down to Italy, where it was nearly 50%, and the US averaging about a 35% fall at the depth of the slump in the first wave. That situation has not really improved very much, as I will explain later on, I hope. And this is key, because it's not been an equal fall, suffering for the working population, for working people around the world. This is a measure of who's been hit the most. This is those people who earn more than $60,000 a year in the US in high wage employment have generally been working at home. They haven't lost their jobs, and they've been able to continue. And actually, their wage levels really haven't declined at all. But those people who are forced to go out to work, can't work from home, or on low wages, they've taken a real hit in terms of what this pandemic has meant and the lockdown. And that's the way the inequality in the hit and the impact on the economic impact upon people can be expressed, at least in terms of employment. And the big inequality is across the so-called developing economies, or the global south, as we use the term for short. And this is the first ever slump in developing economies in the history of recording their growth, because we don't record We haven't recorded their growth for some time, until probably in the post-war period. And this is decline for the first time since reliable records ran. You can see it's way down here. This is now an underestimate because we're now estimating, according to the World Bank, it's going to be around about 9% down here during 2020. So the first slump, all those countries that have expanded to some extent, maybe not as fast as their populations, but they've expanded in GDP growth over the past 20 or 30 or 40 years, are now heading into a major slump. And by the way, this figure includes India. It includes China, which have had dramatic growth rates, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. And what has happened is, of course, the capitalists have pulled all their money out of these countries when they see they went into slump. So these are the two measures of capitalist money flowing into the third world or the global south. The FDI, that's foreign direct investment, that's the buying up companies or building new companies by the multinationals in various countries around the world. It was already slowing down to a pretty low level before the pandemic broke, but you can see that it's gone negative. For the first time as a percentage of GDP, there's actually been a reduction in the amount of foreign direct investment. Money has flowed out, taken back in repatriation of profits rather than building new industries. And that also applies to the financial sector. Buying of bonds and shares has reversed, and the big banks and other institutions of the global north have been taking their money out. This, of course, is creating a serious situation in terms of the ability of these countries to pay their debts and to do anything about the pandemic through health and other public services resources as the money flees. Poverty in the global south is going to be truly awful as a result of COVID, even in 1 year. At the moment, there are nearly 4 billion people who live on less than $5 a day. It's a staggeringly large figure out of 7.3 billion or so in the world. So nearly 60% of the world lives on less than $5 a day. Even that figure sounds incredibly low, but just to tell you that the World Bank says that poverty has been falling, they base their figure of poverty levels at 1.90 cents, $1.90 a day, which of course is a ridiculously low figure. But even on $5 a day, there are 4 billion people living on less than that. And that's a staggering figure. But now, as a result of COVID and the pandemic and the lockdowns or the closures, 150 million children are now living in multi-dimensional poverty. That means without access to essential services. 188 countries imposed school closures, affecting more than 1.6 billion children. An additional 1.2 million under 5 deaths likely to have occurred this year, and as many as 132 million people extra will go hungry in 2020, and of that, nearly 40 million are children. And if you look on the right-hand side here, you can see this was the World Bank's forecast on their ridiculous figure of falling profitability. That was the trajectory, and then they now see the situation going up here. So the poverty levels are going to return to levels we haven't seen since before the Great Recession, even on the World Bank's figure. 463 million children globally cannot get the resources to continue to learn and improve. That's going to seriously damage their future prospects. But also the cost of the United States, just one of the richest countries in the world and most important economic entity in the world, has taken a huge hit. There's a measure by some Keynesian economists, Larry Summers, who's probably well known to you. He has estimated, here is this red block shows you the size of US GDP in any 1 year, approximately. It's about $20 trillion. And then they've estimated how much of that's been lost due to the COVID. So GDP from the pandemic has lost that amount there. Then there's the premature deaths, so people are not able to contribute to GDP anymore, have died early. Then there's those people who have long-term health problems as a result of COVID, they can't work anymore. And the impact also of mental health, people not being able to work or even committing suicide as a result of isolation and so on. Adding that all up, they estimate that something like 16 trillion dollars has been lost in economic and social costs to the US economy in this just 1 year of this COVID so far. So what about recovery? Here we are at the end. We've been through 1 year of hell. We're now going into 21. Can we expect a better, brighter prospect to turn this around, to recover from this COVID and come out the other side in better shape? Well, according to the experts, the multinational institutions, the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF and the OECD, having recognized the collapse in COVID-19 pandemic in the economy, they all expect on the whole a recovery into plus terms for the world as a whole. This figure shows the world, the black blocks, so about a 4% recovery next year. The advanced economies will be a little less, and the global south a little more. Remember, this includes China and India and other countries that haven't done too badly out of this and are recovering, as I'll come to in a minute. But that's their prospect, an optimistic prospect in the sense that there will be growth this year. There'll be more jobs, jobs will come back, production will increase, all the things that are required in order to achieve a better economy or a larger economy will begin to appear in 2021. But is that the case? I want to raise some really doubtful prospects for expecting what is called a V-shaped recovery. Just to remind you that in a recession, capitalist recession in a normal way, drops down on one side of the V, and then it reaches the bottom, and for various reasons, which we can go into, it recovers, and we come back to the other side of the V, and off we go again until we get to the next slump. That's the usual picture. But can we expect that this time? Well, first, as I said before, we have to recognize that over 90% of the world's economies are contracted in 2020. So that has a synchronization effect. It affects even if one country recovers, if it can't export any of its products because all the other countries are still contracting, then it reduces the ability to recover. So no country is an island anymore. Everybody is connected. And therefore, that integration effect not only helps to boost expansion, but also can fail to create expansion because of the synchronization effect. Second, and that's particularly exposed in world trade. World trade has taken a huge drop during the COVID-19 2020, and that means that the opportunity of looking for trade or exports to get out of this slump in 2021 is naturally reduced unless world trade comes back with some vengeance. And I would argue that one of the real weaknesses now for world capitalism is that productive investment per head and the profitability of investing in productive investment, they're at all-time lows. Capitalism works on the basis of investing for profit, producing for profit. For no other reason, it doesn't invest or produce for social need. It invests for profitability for the big multinationals and others, and otherwise they won't invest. And both investment per head and profitability, on average, as we know there are companies that are making huge profits, we can go into that, but on average, profitability is at all-time lows for the major capitalist economies at the moment. So that makes it very difficult to get a good recovery. So after one of the largest yearly declines in 150 years, and certainly the largest since 1945, it's going to take a long time to restore and repair some of the damage that has taken place both in the employees and in means of production as well. This is called hysteresis in mainstream economics. It means that such is the damage, it causes permanent damage, a bit like long COVID causes permanent damage. Once you've had COVID, a lot of people cannot recover without having permanent illnesses. This is the same thing for the economy. It'll be very difficult to recover from that. And finally, another reason not to expect a V-shaped recovery is the huge increase in debt that has been incurred in order to finance all the support programs, mainly for big business, mainly for the banks, but also for labor in order to make sure that they don't all starve in many countries. And that's dramatically increased the levels of debt in the public sector, but also the corporate sector has a very high level of debt to GDP. And that makes it very difficult for them to fund new investment and to recover when they have to pay back and service the existing debt. I'll come into that again a bit more. So if you can see, take some of those examples. This is the state of investment in the major developed economies, the G20, the top 20 economies over the last 30 years. You can see that as a percentage of GDP, it has been showing a tendency to fall over that period of time. So when we get to the Great Recession, it dropped to a new low. It's recovered a bit after 2019. We're now down here somewhere with the level of investment to GDP, the lowest level of all. That's going to, even if it recovered to this level in the next few years, that would still be relatively low. We cannot expect fast growth when the investment to GDP ratio is down here instead of up here as it was in the 1980s. And then we can look, the reason for that very low investment rate is that the G20's average rate of profit on the stock of capital they've got in their investment has been falling. There is a long run tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Those who follow my blog know that I make a big fuss about this because I consider it's the most important thing to analyze when we're looking at the health of a capitalist economy, what is happening to profitability. And you can see the golden age of capitalism in the post-war period was when profitability was high. This G20 includes some of the global south economies as well. And then we had the terrible profits crisis from the late 60s to the early 80s with the crushing of the trade unions, the big slump and privatizations and so on. Capitalism drove the profitability up on average in most countries, but still way below the golden age here. And then we entered a period after in the 21st century of a gradual decline again in the rate of profit. There was a bit of a boost in the credit boom period. Then we got the Great Recession. And you can see, according to my estimates, as of 2017, this goes up to, that we're really pretty close to the lowest levels that profitability has been in the top 20 economies in the world. It's even worse when you do the G7. But that shows you there's real difficulty in capitalism coming out of this crisis with any degree of fast growth and sustained growth. And as I say, debt levels are significantly higher than they were at the beginning of this century. The world GDP, debt to GDP, this is just non-financial corporate debt. So not the public sector, which everybody goes on about in the mainstream, not the banks and what debts they've got, but just the most important part, the productive sectors of the economy, the corporate sector. They're now at 90% of GDP in the world and most mature markets, and also in the top 30 emerging markets. That's a level which is something like 50% higher than it was 20 years ago. That's a burden all the time on the ability to reinvest, to grow, when you still have to use much of your profits to service existing debt. And as I said before, world trade growth is dramatically down. And it's not just the COVID slump, which you can see here, but also if you look at the period before the Great Recession, average world trade growth was about 6% a year. Since the Great Recession, it's only been 2% a year. So for the first time, we had a period where trade growth was slower than GDP growth. That means that if you've got a problem in the domestic market, you couldn't rely upon export markets to solve your problem because that was growing faster. That situation has been reversed now. So the globalization of the world through trade and investment, which is expressed in that high growth rate in trade compared to GDP, has been reversed. Globalization's been stopped or curbed or expired at the moment and is well down. And I can't see that that's going to dramatically improve, as I'll show later on, in the next few years to return things through a V-shaped recovery. And as I said, even before we got to the pandemic in 2020, the world economy was heading into a recession. The best measure of this is to look at what's happening with global profits, not the profitability, the average profit against capital, but the actual total profits, whether they're growing or falling. And you can see that's a very good guide to whether there'll be a slump. The last slump we had was around about then when profits went negative. The Great Recession, the profits growth was negative. This is the top 6 economies' global corporate profits, which we can measure. We even got nearly a mini recession in 2016 when we were negative. And just on 2019, it's been flat, and now we've gone into COVID, at the beginning of 2020, we were negative. Global profits are down here now. They're down at minus 20%. And that shows it's very difficult to imagine a recovery. But even before, the argument here is we were heading into a slump that we hadn't seen since 2009. And there's no end to COVID. That's the other thing that you have to bear in mind for this year. The new cases of COVID-19, as we can see, were rocketing in the United States. Both the new cases and the deaths and hospitalizations at levels we haven't seen. In the case of deaths, we're down compared to the terrible period of April and May. But in case of hospitalization, we're at record levels. And in case of new cases, we're also at record levels. This COVID virus has not gone away. So that is another blockage to the ability of making a quick and V-shaped recovery. And because of this, a lot of countries have been forced back into lockdowns or have maintained quite severe voluntary social distancing. People aren't going out or being told not to go out. People are not working, there's no leisure facilities and other service sector industries are not taking place. So the total activity has collapsed. This is the latest figures on mobility and economic activity in the world. You can see where this was the disaster last at the beginning of 2020 of the pandemic. It looks as though we're all getting back to normal for a while, and then it started to falter, and now we've dropped dramatically as we go into 2021. So another reason to expect not a quick V-shaped recovery. But what about economic policy? What about government policy? Surely the huge amount of money that's been thrown at the pandemic by the Federal Reserve and other central banks and by governments in fiscal spending. Of course, as we know, we've had one package in the US Congress earlier this year. Then we had a second package just gone through under the control of the Republicans, and quite likely under the new Biden administration, very shortly we're going to get a supplementary package to that, more spending to keep businesses going and to provide some support to working people. But if we look at credit injections, where has all that money gone? Well, most of it went to banks and big business. A smaller amount went to small businesses. And most of the credit injections ended up in the financial sector. The big companies salted away this money or bought their own shares with it or speculated in the stock market. Small businesses used it to pay down some of the debts that they got or sustain or to service the existing debts that they had. They didn't invest. They didn't increase production, partly because they couldn't, but also because they just didn't have the resources to do so. So most of that federal credit injection has gone into the stock market. And we can see here's the blue line. The stock market collapsed on the news of the pandemic. Then the Fed intervened with a massive injection up to nearly $7 trillion now. And you can see that the stock market rocketed back upwards and is currently at all-time highs at the moment. So on the one hand, people's lives and livelihoods are disappearing. The economy is in deep recession, but don't worry, the stock market is booming, and those people who own all the stocks and shares, which is only mostly the top 1%, are making a real killing. And then we come to the fiscal spending. Here we can see there's been the biggest fiscal spending ever, particularly in the major advanced capitalist economies, anything up to 11, 10%. The US is around 8, it will shortly probably be up here somewhere. Huge fiscal packages as a percentage of GDP. This was in the first wave. Second wave is added to this across the board. And so this is a huge amount of money that's been thrown at the pandemic, both to provide incomes, sometimes with paychecks, sometimes with furlough money, sometimes money to businesses to pay workers and so on, but also basically straightforward handout and grants to big business in particular. Airlines and other travel companies have had huge monies thrown at them by the government. But has this succeeded in turning the economy around? No. Well, the argument is that once the lockdowns are over, then it will. But I very much doubt that this money will end up leading to a growth in productive investment and GDP over the next period. Oops, what has happened there? Let's come back. Hold on, sorry. What have I done, naughty boy? Yeah, let's go back here. Right. So, if I got that right, yeah. So in my view, there's not going to be a return to normal growth as we've seen before. A lot of other people agree. UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Congress on Trade and Development, put out a report recently, and they showed what they think is likely to happen. So here we were in 2017 at 95% of 29 GDP. There's 100% of 29 GDP. Then we get the slump. In COVID, this year, they say it's going down to 95, 96% of GDP. We get a recovery, but we don't get a recovery back to where it would have been without the pandemic if we continued on that trajectory. So there's a huge gap here. So even if there's a recovery, we still don't get back at the end of 2021 to where we were in 2019. That's 2 years later. And we certainly don't get back to where we ought to have been if there'd been no pandemic and lockdown. The same, that's the global situation. The same applies to the US. We get exactly the same phenomenon, a huge drop, a recovery, but we can then continue a trajectory which is way short of the pre-pandemic growth rate. And look, that goes into 2024 and 2025, which gives you an indication of how basically it means we're never going to get back to the pre-pandemic growth rate. This is lost forever as a result of what's happened and the inability of capitalism to recover. It's a very important point. In my book, The Long Depression, I refer to a depression taking the form graphically of a reverse square root. You have a V shape, you can have a W shape, a double dip recession, but in a depression, you get what I call a reverse square root. And those of you who can think about it, you drop down on one side of the V, you come up again, but you don't return to the previous trajectory level and you fall short. So you get a new trajectory, a different trajectory, which is like a reverse square root. Of course, some countries are going to recover much more quickly. And which are they? Well, contrary to the views of the COVID conspirator, the answer is the faster and more depth you put into containment, repression of the virus, if necessary by lockdown, by test and trace and so on, the quicker and better the recovery. Those countries that have applied those weaponry, severe lockdowns, test and trace, good health systems to cover, mass testing, cooperation by the population, have been able to get back to levels of growth in GDP and employment and get people's jobs back very quickly. This year, China will grow overall, not by its usual 6 or 7%, by up to 2%, but nevertheless it will be growing. That's the growth threshold there. Even Vietnam will grow. Vietnam's fairly, Taiwan and South Korea are fairly close, and you can go across. You can see that we get down here into the big countries. The US is well behind the line, and down here is sorry old UK with Boris Johnson and Spain, a complete disaster, cumulative deaths at maximum. This is reverse figure, so you can see, and it's out of date, but you can see the most number of deaths per million are down here, and the biggest drop in GDP in 2020 is down here, and these two countries, Spain and the UK, have got that prize down the bottom there. So only China has had a V-shaped recovery. It's coming out fast. The forecast will be that China will be up here compared to where it was before the pandemic, more or less back into the trajectory it had before, while countries like the Eurozone and the US will have that reverse square root thing I'm saying before, falling short before the pandemic. Again, these are figures coming from official sources, not invented by me. But what about the vaccines? Will the vaccines turn it around? Well, it is a fantastic achievement that public financed scientists, universities, backed by public funds of massive proportions, have enabled us to get what appears to be pretty effective vaccines, at least at first sight, into a situation of distribution at the beginning of 2021. So within a year, we've been able to achieve that, when vaccines can take anything up to 4 years to actually be delivered and be fully effective. Annual flu vaccines, as I said before, are only 60% effective. It appears that the ones that we've been able to develop with new techniques, new science, is anything between 75 and 90%, so far as we can tell at the moment. But There'll be more pandemics to come. This is not the end of it. Even if these vaccines are distributed sufficiently effectively to the people that matter within the next 6 months, there's every prospect that we could have further pathogens and health systems remain underfunded and inadequate to deal with them. And there's no international cooperation or plan to both distribute these vaccines effectively or to do anything about what caused the viruses to arrive in the first place, which I mean was industrial farming, fossil fuel, timber logging, etc. And these medicines are mainly having been done by public companies and universities are now under the control of big pharmaceutical companies and it's the big advanced capitalist countries that are buying up all these vaccines. You can see in this graph that the countries that are failing to achieve that are the global south are just not getting the sort of amount of vaccine that they need, treatments per capita, in order to supply their population. As Peter Maybard has said, federal scientists helped to invent it and taxpayers are funding its development. It should belong to humanity. It should be a people's vaccine, but it isn't. It's in the hands of private companies and that governments are paying billions to these companies in order to get these access to this. That's the situation for 2021 as far as I can see. But longer term, I think there's permanent scarring towards the capitalist economy as a result of the pandemic. As I said before, the massive increase in fiscal spending is going to leave something like 25 to 30 trillion has been spent, equivalent to 30% of the world's GDP, in order to try and support people and businesses during this pandemic. And you can see that adds up to a huge fiscal gap that will build up over the next few years, which governments are faced with servicing in some way. What that means is that if they issue bonds to finance this fiscal deficit and this government spending, those bonds have to pay an interest. Interest rates are virtually near zero, and governments can issue bonds that last for 10 years or maybe even longer, so they don't have to pay them back straight away. So in that sense, you could say that it's fundable, it's financeable to do that. But it just takes a change in the interest rate to cause a serious problem, particularly for global south countries that are already in difficulty in trying to issue bonds to raise any funds at all, or to even meet their existing bond liability payments. Several governments have already defaulted as a result in 2020, and I think there could be more. So this is a real problem going forward, this huge level of deficits. Public debt is going to reach a post-World War peak in this lockdown, both for the advanced countries and for the emerging market economies. And that, as I say, can be financed for the moment, but down the road is a tremendous burden upon the ability of governments to improve public services and so on. So what a lot of governments will be ending up doing is just spending money on arms and security for capitalism and paying the interest on the debt that they've built up, cutting back on welfare entitlements, pension entitlements, and on public services in general. That's the sort of direction things are going in over the next 3, 4, 5 years as a result. And as I say, the trade situation is unlikely to improve. We continue to have this huge gap from previous trajectory. This is the world trade growth trajectory before, as I said before. Then we had the Great Recession and we went on to this particular trajectory. And then after the pandemic, we're now down here somewhere. The trajectory is way, way, way away from that dotted blue line. That shows you how serious globalization has been reversed as a result of the pandemic. So we have my classic reverse square root. That's where we would have been going. The pandemic's taken us down here and we're going to end up going along here. So $12 trillion in the world economy, probably more, has been lost forever. I think that's what I remember. Capitalist recessions, slumps in production and investment, means you lose resources, people's lives, their employment, their wages forever. They're lost forever if they're unemployed, if they can't get jobs, if investments cut back. And this is the same here. This is a cumulative output loss that will not be recovered as a result of the pandemic. But what about capitalism usually gets out of these crises? Can it get out of these crises by cutting back sharply on investment in industry and so on, so that it saves on costs and that? Can it let all the small businesses go to the wall and the strong take over and be in a position to move forward? And can it then use a cheaper labour force willing to work, a smaller labour force with better technology and boost productivity and profitability that way? Joseph Schumpeter argued that that's how capitalism works. Slumps kill off the inefficient monopolies, like COVID kills off the sick and the old, and it allows the smaller, innovative firms to flourish, like COVID allows the young people to come through. Similarly, Marx said it's more like slumps kill off the weak and the small and allow the more efficient and large to consolidate and grow. But with central banks buying all the debt on all the corporate bonds, and many public companies are continuing to survive just by making a bond issue, the likely outcome may be that we just don't have the killing off of the weak and the small, but we have more and more companies becoming what might be called zombie companies. That is, that they don't produce enough profit to actually expand investment productively and take things forward creatively, as Joseph Schumpeter would say, but they just survive enough in order to pay the interest on their debt and their workers' wages and just trundle along in that way. It's true that bankruptcies are on the rise, and that would suggest that perhaps in 2021 and 2022, we could get, say, a financial crash, which would create the conditions for laying off of loads of workers and wiping out of lots of bad deadwood companies to create a new environment for growth under capitalism. At our expense, of course, going down the road of this next decade. But there's still an awful lot of zombie companies around, and they are being propped up as they were during the Great Recession. In fact, zombie companies are now contribute 1.4 trillion in terms of debt. That gives you an indication of the size of these companies which still hang around both in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. So, can devaluation of capital and productivity be achieved? Well, there are things to look further down the road. And this is where we're now looking a bit longer, not just at the next few years, but even further. The workforce is, as a result of the pandemic, but even before, is beginning to automate fast. And according to the latest estimates and reports, up to 85 million jobs are likely to be displaced as a result of the introduction of automation, of AI, and various other things. So that the workforce may expand as a result of technology, but also a load of jobs are going to disappear. There's going to be a dramatic movement between old industries going out of the way and old techniques being replaced by new ones. Whether that will create enough new jobs remains to be seen. McKinsey here argues that we'll lose 85 million jobs and gain 97 million out of the robot revolution. Even if that was true, just think about it. What does that mean for those who are in the bad old industries? Will they be able to move into these new industries, or will they be out of work forever, being replaced by other people who've got the skills? And we know from this pandemic, we're talking now remotely, that remote work appears to be here to stay. So employers are saying that they're going to maintain this remote work much more. It's going to expand. Perhaps even 50% of employers are looking to put half their workforce operating remotely. Why? Because they can cut back hugely on costs of buildings and equipment, security staff, and so on. I don't know about you, but if you get a contract with a company at the moment to work remotely, they don't pay for your electricity, your broadband, and all the equipment that you've got. They just expect you to work so many hours and they pay you accordingly. They're saving all. That's the sort of money that they're going to hope to save while boosting the productivity of the workforce at the same time. Well, that remains to be seen whether that will work. So finally, I just want to deal with some of the major global challenges coming forward in this decade, coming as we come out of this pandemic, if and when we do. First, just to remind ourselves what the UN Secretary General said recently, Antonio Guterres. He said, this pandemic has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies which we have built. It's exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The first fallacy is that free markets can deliver healthcare for all. Well, that's certainly true, being proved a lie. The next one is that unpaid care work is not work. How important has unpaid care work been during this pandemic, socialization and lockdown? It's been vital. It's an essential part of maintaining society, and capitalism does not pay for it in any way. And the other fiction is that we live in a post-racist world. Well, 2020, particularly in the US, but everywhere, has proved that we do not live in a post-racist world. The pandemic has brought that home more strongly. Who suffers most in the pandemic? Who is in hospital most? Who is dying the most? Who is faced with repression the most when they protest, and so on? And the myth that we're all in the same boat is really a myth. As I've shown, that the top 1% in most economies have had no impact at all on their economic livelihoods, and as a whole on their health as well, because they don't face the same risks that people who have to go to work for a living have faced, not only in the US and Europe, but particularly in the global south, in countries like Mexico and Brazil, where the vast majority, and India, where the vast majority of workers are in informal work. They have to go to work. They don't can't go remote. They're not paid by their employers. They're on day-to-day work. They're forced to go out and face the risk, and have been resulted in large numbers of deaths as a result. What will global leaders do about this? Will they do anything about inequality? Will they do anything about the things we've talked about, says Guterres? Well, the answer probably is, of course, no. We can see now that inequality is now a major issue around the world. This is the top wealth share in the US. Of the top 0.11%, they now have dramatically raised their share of total personal wealth of the US. So 0.01%, not the 1% where we talked about it, even tenth smaller than that, hundredth smaller than that, have got 4% of the world's wealth. There's a rising inequality of income and wealth across the major economies of the world. Poverty, according to Philip Alston of the UN Special Rapporteur, has never been so bad. Even before the pandemic, 3.4 billion people, I think it's more like 4, nearly half the world live on less than $5.50 a day. And that number has barely declined, says Alston, since 1990. And remember, this includes China in particular, which is a dramatic improvement in reducing poverty over the last 30 years. If you take China out, this figure is truly awful in the level of poverty that remains. And of course, global warming and climate change. There's now a 1 in 5 chance that the annual global temperature will be at least 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than in pre-industrial times in the next 5 years. So the Paris Accord of trying to limit it to 1.5 degrees increase is very unlikely to be achieved. In fact, it's almost certain it's going to be exceeded with all the result in environmental destruction. And of course, as I say before, every possibility that we'll get new pandemics, new pathogens, or we know for certain now that COVID-19 will not disappear. It's going to become endemic. It's going to come back every year, and we're going to have to deal with it like we do with other diseases on an annual basis. And of course, the growing international tensions that result from decline in trade and investment and cooperation, and in particular between the US and China. Just to quickly deal with these points. This is the latest figures on global warming. As of this week, this year, 2020 tied with 2016 as the hottest ever. And you can see we're now at 1.25 degrees above the industrial level, pre-industrial level. So we're heading very fast towards that 1.5 figure, which supposedly the governments of the world were going to avoid achieving. And it's a climate disaster. Look at this. This is the latest figures for the US. This year, 2020, 22 disasters, 262 dead, $95 billion in damages from climate-driven catastrophes across the US, as you well know, in California, fires and other things, which are tornadoes and various other droughts and floodings which have taken place just in the US. Of course, it applies globally as well. And as I say before, there's no sign that inequality is declining. Here's the very latest figures from the Fed out this week of the share of personal wealth in the US. If you look on the left-hand scale, share of personal wealth for the top 1% has gone from about 23.5% to around 31%. That's basically a 30% increase in the last 30 years. And if you look on the right-hand scale, which shows the bottom 10%, it's never been higher than 4% anywhere. The bottom 10% get less than their share. And that's dramatically fallen during the last, over the first 20 years, like 30 years, to nearly down to just under one, around 1, and it's hardly creeped back up. It's half where it was 30 years ago. So increasingly, inequality of wealth, this income's the same in the US and in other countries. And we have the threat of what's coming to people's jobs and livelihoods with no indication that people will maintain their livelihoods as a result if capitalism moves in the direction of automation, AI, and the expansion of jobs. Who's going to rule here? Is it capitalists owning the robots that are going to be crushing labor? Or can we turn this around and use the new technology, the new ways of developing the productivity later, reduce hours, to expand and improve living conditions for people, which is the direction that the economy is going to go over the next generation as these new technologies come in. And most important, probably immediately, is the real danger of a new Cold War. It's already there, and we only have to note the comments of Pompeo, who has just another fortnight to go, I think, before in his job. But he said, if we don't act now, the Communist Party in China will erode our freedoms and subvert the rule-based order that our free societies have worked so hard to build. Rules-based order, that's a joke, given the Trump administration. The old paradigm of blind engagement with China won't get it done. We must not continue it. In other words, end the policy of engagement, of cooperating with China on trade and other matters, and move to the policy of containment, of restricting China, of trying to curb it and close it down. So finally, Chair, I just want to present a few alternatives to this scenario, which is heading towards us. Firstly, on resetting the economy. We as socialists should be looking to build a global plan for full employment with jobs for all at a living wage. Pensions and benefits of those who cannot work must be raised, probably to 2/3 of the average wage. We can't just think of wages, we have to think of the benefits and pensions, the public goods and services which are required. We need public investment in infrastructure and services like health, education, housing, transport, communication. They can be delivered free at the point of use if we redraw the way in which we raise funds and where we spend it. Now, at the moment, most governments spend something like 3 to 5% of their GDP on military weaponry and arms. They spend huge amounts of money on subsidizing industry and on security and other completely wasteful areas. A lot of this money could be transferred if we had the ability to control these sectors and develop. Already some countries have introduced free transport. It's perfectly possible all these areas of public services to move to a free at the point of use, to be financed by taxation and the resources produced by the workforce. We need investments in harmony with nature and the planet. The fossil fuel industry has got to be phased out to stop this climate change, just as tobacco and the military should be phased out as well. We need an expansion in social need, social economy, rather than in private profit. We need to cancel the debts of the poorest countries who are being exploited by the big multinationals. It's not a big amount of money. If we cancel their debts and provided the international cooperation on investment and growth, not on exploiting them and speculating in their resources and taking their resources, we could transform the world for many of those countries too. And we could save something like 8% of GDP for every country in the world if we ended the tax havens for the rich and the powerful who continue to hide their money away from governments trying to tax them. We need to introduce a proper progressive taxation system to reduce the inequalities we've been talking about. Fundamentally, we need to change from a capitalist economy to a socialist economy. We need public ownership of the big banks and institutions globally and the big multinationals so that the world can be planned on a democratic basis for social objectives and not for the profit of the few. And in my view, that is what we have to fight for as the alternative to the prospects which are presented to us by capitalism over the next few years and over the generation ahead. Thanks.
Wow, Michael, that was an incredibly informative presentation. just thank you so much for bringing it to us and doing all that work that's involved with pulling that together. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a short break and a quick announcement about upcoming sessions and a short fundraising break. And then when we come back, we'll have question and answer period. If people want to ask questions of Michael, you should go to the participant section and raise your hand on the participant section in Zoom, and we'll have 2 minutes. We'll take them in order for you to ask questions, make comments, and then Michael can respond. So before we do that, Raj, can you talk about next week's session, please?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you, Michael, for this exciting presentation. Next Sunday, we have another one, which is on the farmers' protest and the agricultural crisis in India. The speaker will be G.N. Nagaraj. He is an agronomist located in southern part of India in the state of Karnataka. And he used to work for the state government, helping farmers improve their crops. But he resigned in 1987 because he saw the then government had no interest in farmers' well-being and has been associated with the farmers' unions ever since 1987. So he will be presenting his point of view in support of the farmers' strike next Sunday. So that should be an interesting program. As you know, Abhinav Sinha presented one in this forum a few weeks ago. And so this will be a different point of view. And I think it'll be very interesting to compare the two presentations. And I look forward to everyone coming back and raising issues and getting to know what the situation is, because it's a very big issue in India right now. Thank you.
Great. If you're interested in future programs, you can go to our website at ICSSmarks.org, and we have our future schedule up there and a way to sign up for notifications. Can we get a quick announcement from Richard Fallenbaum about fundraising? Richard?
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to post on the chat information on how to contribute. As Alan said earlier, in addition to our relatively small expenses, we continue to support the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, California, with our funds. So any funds you contribute, most of that will go to help support the library, which is our physical and spiritual home, and to support the work. So I'm going to post it right now in the chat. We'll see it. It provides information on how to send checks to me, but most of all, the easiest way to send money is through PayPal. Some people have expressed interest in other formats for sending, electronic formats. Some of them are not practical or expensive, but some may be practical, like Zelle. So please contact me on that email address, icssunday@yahoo.com, and I will send you more information. Thank you.
Yes. Also, if you, after the presentation, the fundraising information is posted on the website too, so you can get that information there. Great. So why don't we get started? People, if you want to ask questions, go ahead and raise your hand. And you'll have 2 minutes to ask your question or make a comment about the presentation. So you do that by going to the participants window and then pressing raise your hand next to your name.
If Alan, if people have the newer version of Zoom, then it's under the reactions. There's a button called raise hand.
Okay. All right. Let me get started. I'm going to kick it off with a quick question. There were a couple of slides, Michael, that were towards the end of your presentation that I think were really quite important. And I wanted you to just comment a bit about what they represent. You talked about the run up in debt, the increase in the number of zombie companies, and the possibility of financial fragility leading to a crash in the upcoming period. Can you put that just a little bit in the context of what we saw 10 years ago and what we might expect in the next year and a half or so?
Yeah, okay. Well, as we know, back in 2008-9, the big Great Recession slump started with a financial crash. It started with a load of banks and mortgage lenders finding that the mortgage that they packaged off and tried to sell to each other to make money were no longer worth what they claimed to be worth, because a load of people who had taken out mortgages in order to participate in the housing boom that had taken place couldn't maintain their mortgage payments. So a load of what called subprime mortgages went belly up, and as a result, a load of banks and institutions found themselves with worthless securitized bonds. That led to a series of bankruptcies for big banks as well, and that cascaded into the Great Recession slump. I argued at the time, of course, that was merely the appearance, that was the trigger that caused it. What was already happening was that the profitability of productive sectors of capital were already very low, and that's why everybody was speculating in housing, property, and the stock market rather than investing productively. So when that started to go down, like a house of cards, then the underlying rottenness of the health of the capitalist system at the time was exposed, and we got this big slump. So we started with a financial crash, then we went on to an investment crash, production slump, and eventually people got unemployed, and a consumption slump. It went in that order: finance, investment, consumption, or production. This time, because it's come away from outside, it started with a production crash, because the lockdown and social distancing meant the closure of swathes of industry and particularly services across the world. So we got a supply shock, if you like, to use the mainstream term, first, not last. And then we got a demand shock, because people were at home, they weren't traveling, they weren't spending money, or they didn't have so much money anymore, they were having to meet their debts without any employment. So we got a demand shock. We haven't had that financial crash. We haven't had the banks going to the wall. They've been heavily funded and supported. They're also a bit stronger than they were back in 2008. There's been prevention measures to ensure that they're more robust, but they've also been heavily funded, and so have the big corporations on the whole to survive. So we haven't seen a whole series of corporate bankruptcies yet, or banks and financial institutions going under. Just one or two odd ones that have gone down in the worst sectors of the weakest ones who probably would have collapsed anyway. But there's a possibility that that could change in 2021, because what I'm arguing here is that we've got a load of small companies and larger companies who are just surviving on drip feed money from the government through cheap loans coming through from the Fed, or from grants from the government, fiscal support, and they're not making any money, and they don't have prospect of making much profit at all. They're in a deeply bad situation, and they're just being kept alive by this drip feed at the moment. That's why we call them zombie companies. They're the undead. They're not dead, but they go around like zombies as though they were dead. And that's the nature of a whole swathe of companies, not just in the US, but also in Europe. Now, it could be that they will continue to be drip fed and they won't collapse, and will stagger on with very low growth rates a low trajectory growth rate, low investment and so on, but without a financial crash. But I think there's a real possibility, particularly if there's any reversal of government policy on Fed largesse and on the administration not funding much more over the next year or two, that we could enter a whole series of corporate collapses, which could create that financial crash. So the way I'm seeing it is, instead of the financial crash being triggering a production and investment crash, we've had a production crash and an investment crash. This could trigger down the road if profitability doesn't rise fast enough to compensate for a financial crash. So it's a reverse thing, ending up in a worse situation down the road. That's the possibility over the next year to 18 months.
That's pretty ominous, pretty ominous. Let's go ahead and next up I'm going to have Mehmet, why don't you ask your question, followed by Susan, followed by Richard W, and then Raj.
Michael,
ahead,
thank you for a great presentation. What I'm hearing is that we had a financial crisis, and then there was the pandemic crisis. So I can already see that the powers be are going to be blaming everything on the pandemic. But as I think you also mentioned, is that the signs of our crisis was shown even long before the pandemic showed up. So I don't know, this could be a speculative question, but are there any studies that try to separate these two crises? Right now, we have a perfect crisis, all the crises coming together. But is there a way to separate these as saying, if the pandemic had not happened, this is the trajectory that we would have seen, or any studies about that? Thank you.
Well, I think I tried to argue that even before the pandemic began, I gave you a series of graphs which showed falling profitability, falling investment, and in particular, an end in the growth of global corporate profits in the major economies. Those that I've written a number of papers on, and other people have too, those are the key indicators for telling you if you're going to get a slump. That the trigger of the slump could be a rise in the oil price, it could be a collapse in the stock market, it could be a collapse in the property market, as had in the past. But the underlying forces are what's happening to profitability, profits, and investment. And towards the end of 2019, it was not looking good. It looked pretty clear to me anyway, and maybe some others, that we were going to have a slump, a recession of some degree, who could say how much, in the 2020 anyway, even if there had not been a pandemic. So the answer to your question is, I think there were indicators, and some of us did indicate them as the likelihood of a slump in 2020, because capitalism goes into regular and recurring slumps. It's my theoretical argument, not mine, but also that of Marxism, in my view, that capitalism has regular and recurring slumps as a result of its inability to sustain and expand the productive forces unless there's profit there. And if profitability starts to decline, then you get these cycles of boom and slump, you get a collapse in profitability, then you get a slump, which creates the conditions for profitability to rise again by laying off workers, getting rid of the dead wood, the zombies, and replacing them with more efficient and bigger companies that can progress capitalism into a new upswing. So that slumps come along. Between the end of 2009 and the end of 2019, that's 10 years, we had the longest expansion in post-war capitalism, the longest. It was read in the papers all the time. What a great long expansion we've got. But of course, it was the weakest expansion. It was the slowest growth, the poorest investment. Wages hardly moved up at all. People working temporary jobs and contracting work, not really getting full-time skilled work. This was the situation of those 10 years. Inequalities grew, as we saw as well. The stock market boomed, but the real economy did not. And that longest expansion, being the weakest expansion, was a product of the fact that there hadn't been a liquidation of all these rubbish companies. And there hadn't been a liquidation of old people like myself, clearing them out of the employment and getting cheaper, more productive people with better equipment. That process of replenishing capitalist growth has not taken place. It's increasingly difficult for capitalism to do it but that's the process that has to take place. So up to the end of 2019, that looked as though we were going to have that process, that slump, which would have taken place in the last year. And then the pandemic has just quadrupled and quintupled the hit that it's happened to the economy. And as I argued in the presentation, that makes it just doubly more difficult for capitalism to get out of this.
Okay, next up is Susan. If you could unmute yourself, ask your question.
Yes,
Susan.
thank you very much, Michael. In the slides about revealed crises, you talked about, well, excuse me, Michael.
I can't do
You
it.
talked about the crisis in care work, and and there's two kinds of care work. At least one is paid and one is unpaid.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of paid in terms of healthcare workers and in terms of unpaid, work with children, work at home, food, all the rest. Could you elaborate?
Well, you've done well, Susan, in the way you said it. I mean, who have been on the front line during this pandemic? It's been care workers in the sense of hospital nurses, doctors, and other medical staff, and even people just cleaning the hospitals and the general practitioners and all that service that's necessary in order to keep people alive. They've done sterling work. Every day we read now the pressures that the paid care workers in hospitals and in residential care and so on are under, the tremendous pressure they're under in order to help people, also taking at risk of their own lives. And at frontline workers too, another bunch of frontline workers, you might call them paid care workers, are teachers, people who are having to educate children under extremely difficult circumstances, also putting their lives at risk as a result of the spread of the infection, particularly amongst young children, with schools still open. We had the ludicrous position in the UK just at the beginning of this year, the new year, when the government said it was going to open schools on the 4th of January. Then and they opened the schools. The teachers opposed it and said this will be a disastrous mistake. Our Prime Minister said it was completely safe. 24 hours later, he said all schools are closed down because the infections are too much. This is an indication of the pressures that teachers are placed on. These are just paid workers, but think of all the unpaid workers in care. People looking after the elderly relatives and other children for nothing. People who are doing that all the time. This is a massive range of unpaid care work, which is not paid for by capitalism. We have to pay that out of the value of our own labor power. And by that I mean either we pay it out of the wages to people to do this work at home, or we pay it out of the time, huge amount of time that unpaid care workers have to do for relatives, children, and so on. It's a massive operation that working people conduct day in and day out. And then during the COVID, the situation is doubly worse, where elderly relatives who can't get out and shouldn't get out need the support that they can get, and they can't get it from the local services all the time and properly. Then there's all the people who care for disabled people. I mean, it's just horrendous, the situation that exists for a whole layer of people. And we know that one of the worst things in this pandemic has been the deaths in residential care homes has been truly awful, not only for the workers in those places who are seriously psychologically damaged by the fact that all their patients are people who are dying by the droves as a result of the infection, the total failure of government after government to protect residential homes. We know that the privatization and the rejection of social care for the elderly and those who are ill and disabled has been dramatically reduced over the last 20 or 30 years. And then we have this pandemic, and there is no attempt to protect these people. These are the people who have suffered the most in the last 12 months. And as far as I can see, continue to do so. I'm still not convinced that the vaccines are going to get to these area communities, these people sufficiently to save lives in the next 2 or 3 months. So when we're talking about care work, it's care work by the community, by people, and it's uncare by the government and the owners of capital.
I would like to add that I think most of the care work, certainly in homes, is done by women.
Yeah.
And that it's a particular need to address those questions. Thank you.
I would ask people who have questions, go to the participants window, raise your hand. Next up from the great state of Texas is Richard, and followed by Raj, and then Jean. Richard.
The great state with people like Paxton, Abbott, and Ted Cruz, just to name a couple of our great. First off, let me thank you for your presentation. I do like graphs. I do like pictures. I had an ongoing, I want to get to, I've been having power problems here. So but I had an ongoing discussion at one point on two things. One was the return, the return on profit issue, and the other issue was, and I'll get to this one first, I think, is that you talked a lot about being a fiscal crisis, and basically about how the feds were pumping money into the economy, which in fact they are doing. But they've also, if you listen to not Volcker, but is it not Powell? I'm losing. The Fed chair. They keep requesting for Congress to take some action, to basically put money into the economy through the legislative side of things. That has not been happening now for, I don't know, 20 years roughly. It's been blocked, and what has gone in has been really very meager. And so I see a dichotomy going on here. A lot of people are emphasizing the feds and the zombie. I think you mentioned about the zombie companies, which I think are very much a product of accounting, if you will. I mean, they seem to be a lot of shell companies that were created in order to shuffle profits into other companies. So I was just wondering if you could address the other side of this, the productive side of this, because that's facing our Congress, and that is, about spending money to create robots, if you will, or the other thing that strikes me is going into space, which I think is going to be one of those things that nobody's really looking at a whole lot, but I think is sort of the next great frontier, if you will. Thank you.
Well, Richard, yeah, you're right on the, you make a point about really quite a lot of the Fed largesse, which has been huge, has really gone into companies who are gaming the system. Basically, they've, as you say, they've used the money for their own corporate, holding it up, distributing into their thing, into various holding companies, issuing bonds on the basis of having cash holdings provided by the Fed. So a lot of companies who don't need this money, who really have got plenty of cash hoards already, the big companies, the big tech companies, some of the banks, some of the big, even the big travel companies who've got plenty of backed up cash holdings, have got huge support from the Fed, while a whole layer of companies, which I call the zombie companies, who are struggling to survive at all, have not been able to get much out of this at all. The small companies are really difficult to get even the Fed loans coming through as necessary. And Mnuchin, the outgoing Treasury Secretary, actually removed from the Fed about $500 billion worth of money that should have gone to small companies recently, because he said that it wasn't being taken up. It wasn't being taken up because small companies couldn't get hold of it through the banks, who weren't prepared to loan directly to them, because the banks have been saying, yeah, well, you've given us the money to lend to these companies, but these companies are not good risk. They could be out of business in 6 months, and then we're left with the bad debt. So we don't want to lend to them really. So this idea that through Fed credit injections, they can restore the economy and get it going again is full of holes. As you said, that's why the Fed says, well, we can't do it. The Congress has got to spend the money. The fiscal spending has got to take place. We need big boosts in grants, and we need infrastructure spending. We need all that. And don't worry about the deficit for the moment, just spend. Of course, Congress has been locked in paralysis about what to do about this for party political reasons, partly, but also because the ruling groups in society don't want the government to spend huge amounts of money, which later on they'll be asked to pay for by maybe more corporate taxes or rising interest rates on bonds and so on. They're worried about down the road. They want government to stay small, and they don't want it to interfere with the
If I can interrupt you for a second.
Yep.
It's true not only for the U.S. Congress, but it's also true for the Western industrial. For example, you've seen a lot of austerity measures coming out of Europe. In particular, look at Greece. I mean, that's a basket case, and so I mean, it's really a policy of austerity that really needs to be addressed. And anyways, I'll shut up again.
Yeah, I'm with you, Richard. We've seen the policy of austerity over the last 10 years. It's been disastrous. Of course, there's all talk about, don't worry about austerity now, just spend because we've got a slump. But I think we're pretty sure that in a year or so, if they come out of this pandemic and they see that the situation is no longer necessary to fund it at the level they've got at the moment, they'll be looking to take that back in various ways, through higher taxes, through further government spending, and through increases in interest rates on loans. That's coming down the road. And the same situation we've had in the last 10 years is going to arise again. It's not resolved yet. But at the moment, though, all the talk is spend our way out of the COVID.
Okay, next up.
Is that me? I can't hear you, Alan. You muted yourself. Okay, shall I start?
Yeah, Raj.
All right, okay. Thank you, Michael, for a very informative lecture. These pandemics in the last 20 years that you showed us and the ecological crisis, I think they're part of the same global crisis of what I would call capitalism. And my conclusion also added to what you showed, the profit rates from 20% down to under 10%. To me, it's an indication the era of capitalism is over. Okay, in other words, capitalism is dying because it has not been overthrown, it is dying of its own. And Lenin had actually, in 1916, analyzed this situation and said, this is the stage of monopoly capitalism, right? And the way I see it, the monopoly capitalism stage receded because of the two world wars. The first one war is when he wrote Second World War, substantially destroyed productive capacity. Yeah. But then it went right back by 1970s to even a greater crisis. And I don't think there's any way for it to come out. So I haven't heard from you, but I'd like to ask you a question. What about the overthrow? I mean, your analysis is very valuable, but we as Marxists are not interested in workers getting higher wages. We Marxists we know that this crisis cannot be overcome. Workers may get a little higher wages, but they weaken. In capitalism, they lose themselves as human beings. More and more their control of life goes to the capitalist hands. So the question now, if you have any thoughts about, do you see any possibility of overthrow of capitalism given this stage? Or do you think, for what I surmised from your talk, is the best we can do is to make demands for greater reform under capitalism? Please address this when you can.
Well, Raj, your question is the perennial and absolutely huge one that we continually must debate about the possibilities of capitalism's survival and what we do about it. First, I would say that I don't think capitalism dies on its own. I think it goes in a series of crises that could get worse. But it's not going to break down unless we as working people in the labour movement replace the capitalist mode of production with workers' democracy and socialist planning globally, not just in one country. That's the task that we have ahead of us, those of us who will still be around. So capitalism won't die on its own if nothing happens. If working people don't take control of the commanding heights of the economy, don't introduce workers' democracy and really control and plan resources, what will happen is that capitalism will descend into some form of barbarism. We'll go backwards. That is always a possibility. Don't assume that things just progressively go in one direction and it'll get better and better. We can, if the situation is bad enough, capitalism could easily go backwards, particularly if we get coming to power fascist or military regimes in various countries as a result of the crisis, rather than working people taking power. So that is, as you say, the big task is to remove the capitalist mode of production and replace it with a socialist mode, and where under socialist democracy where we can progress. But that doesn't mean to say we don't fight for reforms, that we don't want to improve wages, public services, conditions as they are now. That's part of the struggle. I see the two things to go together. You cannot possibly expect workers to overthrow capitalism tomorrow when they're still struggling to maintain their wages and improve public services. We have to present to them, and that they have to present to us, that what they want get done now, so that we can line up together. And in the course of doing that, what are we doing? We're trying to explain to workers and others, yes, we need better wages. Yes, we need better public services. Yes, we need to end this privatization. Yes, we need a proper health service. But guys, we won't be able to get that and maintain it unless we move to a socialist society. The two things go together. That's the way it seems to me that we have to approach it. And looking around at the screens in front of me, I know that a lot of people there are experienced enough to know that's what has to be done in order to change society. Is that going to happen now? Well, all I could say is I take a view about where it's going now. I think we're still in a pretty depressed situation. I think the labour movements of the Northern Hemisphere are relatively weak compared to where they were when you talked about, Raj, in the period from the end of the Second World War up until the 70s. We've been through a very bad period where reactionary forces have driven and weakened the labour movement. Maybe that will be transformed over the next generation with new industries, new workers. I think one of the things I noticed only in the past month was the developing for the first time of a union in Google, in the Alphabet Workers Union being set up. That's just a tiny little embryo of an indication that we could get workers organizing in these new industries, which could transform the picture and put real pressure on capitalism. But capitalism's been around for, well, let's say 250 years. Actually, that's not very tiny amount of time in human history, and even in social organization. Feudal society lasted 1,000 years or more, slave society even more than that. So capitalism's fairly young, but it's also falling apart fairly quickly. So it's a race against time, it seems to me, to change society.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next up is Jean, followed by Yusuf, followed by Karen, and then Dave. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Well, thanks very much. That was really interesting and exciting. And of course, I agree with your conclusion, as Raj pointed out, that capitalism has no solution to the problems that we face. And that's one of the reasons why I've been supporting Bernie and the squad and those people, even though their solutions are woefully inadequate. Nevertheless, they're worth supporting in my view. But the thing I wanted to ask you about was your book on Engels, because I'm a great admirer of Engels. Excuse me. As an anthropologist, I focus very heavily on Engels' work and bringing that into anthropology and reinterpreting Engels in light of more recent anthropological data. His work on the origin of the family, private property, and the state, is excellent, needing updated, and particular in his views on the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man. What's interesting about that is the fossil discoveries of the past century really have confirmed basically Engels' point that first comes labor, after it language. Those are the stimuli under which the brain of the ape turned into the brain of human beings. So that's a classic work and really important. But he also basically founded the scientific socialism So I know he's done a lot of things. I'd just like you to comment more on what you see as Engels' contributions, because I went so far as to buy the book. It should be coming in tomorrow or the next day. So I'm looking forward to that and interested in what you have to say on Engels and his role for us today.
Well, thank you, Eugene. I couldn't agree more that Engels has been sadly neglected in Marxist analysis and study, particularly in the last 30 years or so. People forget that Engels was the first Marxist before Marx. He was the first person to say that we need a communist society. He was the first person to analyze effectively the position of bourgeois economics, classical political economy, as it was called at the time, and to show that it wasn't economics that was for labor, but for the development of industrial capitalism. He, apart from supporting Marx financially for many decades and having to work in his father's firm to do so, he also contributed dramatically, as you say, Eugene, in the question of understanding the anthropological development of humanity and social organization. And as you say, his ideas have generally been confirmed by modern evidence. And also in his explanation of the relationship between humanity and nature. There's a couple of essays on my blog which deal with that, and it's in the book as well, about how Engels is the first one to notice how nature was being destroyed by the development of capitalism, and it was a need for to bring nature into harmony with humanity, or maybe humanity into harmony with nature, in order to, and that's only going to be possible through the production for social need and for a socialized economy that will bring those things together. Engels develops all these points, and in some detail, particularly after Marx's death, and you can, in my book, I'll cover many of those things. Finally, just there's so much to say about Engels, that's a completely separate subject that you could spend a couple of hours on, but just to say that not only has he been sadly neglected, he's often been denigrated by Marxists in the late 20th century for being dogmatic, to being a determinist. A lot of people don't like the phrase scientific socialism that you mentioned, Eugene, although Marx was happy to support that word as well, merely saying that socialism isn't just a good idea, it's morally a good idea alone, it's more than that. We have to analyze capitalism scientifically to understand what's wrong with it in order to explain how we can progress to a new society that's better for humanity as a whole. Such an idea of scientific socialism seems to be the basis of any understanding of connection with Marx's materialist conception of history, one of the key ideas in Marx's analysis of capitalism. Engels is a genius in many ways in the development of Marxism, and the 250th anniversary, which was last November the 28th, was just an opportunity for me to push his ideas into the circles again after his neglect.
Well, thank you.
Next up is Yusuf, and followed by Karen, followed by Dave. Yusuf, if you could unmute. Can't hear you. Karen, do you want to go ahead? Can you unmute?
Okay,
Yes.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you very much. I think your answer to Raj's question was very much on the point that the struggle for better wages and so on are part of the struggle for revolution. You can't have a revolution with a magic wand, and I do like the term scientific socialism very much. I come from the natural sciences. I'm a physicist originally, and one does have to analyze society scientifically based on reality. Okay, could you sort of expand on your response to Raj. I mean, what do you think will be the immediate consequences of the COVID in terms of our struggle for socialism? Will it lead to maybe a right-wing backlash, or will it be perhaps a revolutionary upsurge, or what do you think in terms of the most immediate political consequences? And
well, Yusuf, it's a big question, Yusuf. I'll need help from everybody on this question, because we have to consider the perspectives, as you say, about what's going to happen. All I can say is economically, the situation remains dire. I always have a view, I don't know what you think of this. I think that the best situation for the transformation...
Later.
The best situation for the transformation of society from capitalism to socialism is when the workers are confident and strong and well organized, but capitalism isn't really in a position to make concessions sufficiently to avoid a move towards a change in society. Now that can happen sometimes after wars, as in 1917, or it can happen at points in history when, after a period of time, workers have got strength, they've got good trade unions, they're organized as a development of socialist ideas and mass party political, and the capitalists are relatively weakening. A difficult situation comes to a crunch in intense class struggle. I think we saw that, at least in my younger days, in the period from the late 60s through to the early 80s, with a series of revolutions overthrew military states in Europe. We saw the Vietnam War. We saw a whole series of setbacks for capitalism. But eventually, those movements did not lead to a change in society. And we've been through a period since the 1980s to now, which is movements which at the moment are relatively small, despite the shocking events of the Capitol and the jamboree that took place there. Fascism is not a mass movement in the US or in Europe anywhere yet, and it's not organized in the forms of militias. Maybe that will happen over the next 5 or 6 years or 10 years, but it will raise also the question of a confrontation and an intense battle. We haven't reached that point yet, but what we do need is a confident, active, and well-organized labor movement. At the moment, we don't have that.
Next up is
Thank you.
Karen, followed by Dave.
Okay, so I really want to thank you for the presentation. It was really comprehensive and I really enjoyed it. One of the things that caught my attention was the graph that showed the pretty consistent long-term decline in the rate of profits. And I was just curious, you know, what your explanation for that long-term decline is, and what the importance sort of under capitalism, the sort of unrelenting requirement of growth, and what that does in terms of environmental degradation and overuse of resources and climate change, and how that fits in with the declining profit, to what extent that's a contributing factor.
Well, Karen, the fundamental thing about capitalism, what is it? It's production for profit. It's not production for social need. It's production of profit for those who own the means of production and the money and the capital. And how do they get that profit? They exploit workers at work. We go to work, we work 8 hours in a day, and we can work it out empirically that we get paid basically 4 hours of labor out of that approximately. And the commodities and services that we produce are worth 8 hours of our labor. So basically 4 hours of labor is unpaid to us because we don't own anything. We have to go to work again the next day. We don't own the means of production. We don't own the equipment. We don't own anything. We just own our labor power. And the owners of capital have got the 8 hours of labor for which they've paid us 4. They've got 4 hours of labor in profit. They can reinvest that for another period of production. They can spend it on their yachts. They can build arms with that 4 hours of labor. They're in control of what happens to the economy and where the decisions made on investment and so on And of course, they're competing with each other, so they're continually trying to drive to get more profit to do so. And that's the fundamental nature of the capitalist mode of production. The point about the falling rate of profit is that, as Marx explains in Capital, and particularly in volume 3, in competing with each other to try and drive up the profit that they're getting out of the workers, they find that there's a limit to how much profit they can get out of workers. They can't make workers work 24 hours a day because they drop dead. They can't really make them work more than 8 hours a day because they have to maintain their families and they have to sleep. So there's a maximum in the hours. They can get more workers if babies are born and put to work, but then also limits on the expansion of the workforce itself. They can make people work harder in those 8 hours so they can get more profit that way. But the main way that capitalists get more when they're competing against each other is by introducing new machinery and equipment. This is what Marx said. There's a massive expansion in the investment in machines, in factories, now in robots, in artificial intelligence, all ways to raise the productivity of labor and therefore increase the profit, to reduce the number of hours in total that workers get paid out of the share of the 8 hours and increase the amount that goes to the capitalists. But in so doing, increasing all that investment in machinery, equipment, and so on, and technology, relative to how much they're spending on the workforce, on us, there is an increase in that investment. And because this is the fundamental point, because profit only comes from workers working, if the relative hours of work that workers are putting in the total production are declining, there's a tendency for the amount of value being produced per unit of production and investment to fall. So there's a tendency for the profitability of that investment to fall. So capitalists are expanding profits in general, but because they compete with each other, they're investing in more machinery, and the contradiction arises as they try to expand productivity and profits, they actually produce a tendency for the profitability of overall capital to fall. It's an amazing contradiction, and one of the great discoveries of understanding the fault lines in capitalism that Marx makes in Capital. So that tendency means that capitalism is continually faced with a contradiction between trying to develop the productive forces and facing a crisis, because they only produce for profit. And if profits start falling, they'll stop producing, they'll stop investing. That's why we get these cycles of booms and slumps that take place. And overall, over the long term, there's a continual decline. Not a straight line, as you can see on that graph, it's ups and downs, and there are reasons for that. But generally, profitability is tending to fall. So it's becoming more and more difficult for capitalism to expand the productive forces, despite their intense efforts to expand the profitability that you get out of workers. They continually face this contradiction. That is the kernel, it seems to me, for understanding the nature of crises under capitalism. By the way, that theory, or that law of profitability, is generally not agreed by most Marxists. Most Marxists and socialists don't look at that particular theory, and they're wrong if they don't, but they don't. They think that crises come about because workers don't get paid enough, or crises come about because banks have reckless greed and make financial speculative decisions, or that there's too much debt. All those things are relevant, but they're not the decisive factor that drives crises regular and recurring under capitalism. So that's why we have big arguments amongst us Marxist economists, a bit like scientists who argue about black holes and things. We argue about the nature of the crises under capitalism. But that's my view. I think it's Marxist, and I also think it's supported empirically as well as the most clear way of understanding what is going on with capitalism in its booms and slumps.
We're getting close to our time. Next up is Dave, followed by Eric, followed by Gulden. And why don't you go ahead, Dave?
Oh, hi, Michael. I really want to thank you for this excellent lecture, and also your book, The Great Recession, was very helpful in understanding the concepts, Marxist concepts, especially of the value, rate of profit, and the composition of the capital. So, and I have two questions on that. One is, what do you think is the level of the value rate of profit, which spells doom to the companies, corporations? And second one is that the new cycles in the capitalist economies start usually when all the or most of the debt has been liquidated, and now we are still piling the debt. There is no a sign of any liquidation. So I'm wondering, what do you see the scenarios for the liquidation of debt, public and private debt?
Well, as I said, Dave, in the presentation, that we have the possibility that the zombies will stagger on being financed by the Fed and support from governments rather than have a liquidation. Back in 1931, the Treasury Secretary then, who was his name now? I can't remember, but one of the chemical barons was the Treasury Secretary. And he said, what we need is a good liquidation. We need to liquidate all these old companies, clear it out so that the capitalist economy can progress, having cleared out all the dead wood. This is a view of the Austrian economists, or the school of Austrian economists, who say that we have too much debt. That's what causes crises. What we need to do is liquidate all this debt and the companies that go with it, and then you can have a fresh boom. It doesn't matter about a slump. They don't care if 10 million people are unemployed or 20 million people are unemployed. That's the way of the world, and that's how capitalism can progress again. Of course, the capitalist elite at the moment and the strategists of capital are very frightened to go down that road because they fear that would cause a political explosion, and they hope that Keynesian policies will work, namely that we just print more money, we spend more money, we run deficits and worry about the debt later on, and this will get capitalism going. I think you're right. If they continue that policy, we'll just continue with the zombies. We'll just have low growth. We won't have a refreshed start for capitalism to boom. It'll just crawl along as it has done over the last 10 years, possibly at an even lower rate, which can only open up the possibility for more financial crashes down the road and another slump. So, but they want to kick the can down the road, I think is the phrase. They don't want to pick the can up. They want to kick it down the road and hope if they move it further down the sidewalk, it won't be in their way now. So that seems to be the policy at the moment. I don't see any sign. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we will have creative destruction, as Schumpeter think, that they will liquidate and go for creative destruction using robots and AI and a smaller workforce. But that's going to be a major political and economic transformation, which so far they've not been prepared to do in any of the major imperialist countries at this stage. But if the sluggish stagnation that exists and continues over the next rest of this decade, then there's every possibility that that might eventually have to be what they turn to.
Okay, next to are Eric and then Gulden. Eric?
Hi, so I have a question about the dollar. Both Russia and China are gradually de-dollarizing, and with the United States printing more and more dollars to shore up the economy, the U.S. economy, these zombie companies, etc. What do you think are the prospects in the short term and the long term for a dollar crisis in terms of the dollar remaining the reserve currency?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think we've seen a bit of a decline in the dollar during the pandemic year. As you say, this is partly because US has spent a lot more printing dollars for the world to keep the world going, and also to keep the US economy's business sector going. So there's a lot more dollars in the world. And when there's a lot more dollars in the world relative to other currencies like the euro or the yen or the Chinese renminbi, then dollar starts to decline in value relative to those. But let's be clear. If we look at the data, if we look at foreign exchange reserves around the world, the dollar, foreign exchange reserves, dollar constitutes 65% of all foreign exchange reserves in the world. It's still by far the biggest currency that everybody uses either to store their value, this is governments and central banks, or to transact trade and investment in oil and other products, generally transacted in dollar terms, in dollar prices. It's still the dominant currency. The financial sector is dominated by dollar investments, dollar bonds, dollar stocks, and so on. It's still the biggest and most important currency in the world. And given the fact that the US has the biggest military in the world, all the rest of the world's military is not bigger than the US put together. That means that there's a big support for maintaining the dollar, not only as the reserve currency, but also the dollar as the currency of imperialism, if you like. Now, it is true that there has been a relative decline in the position of the dollar. The euro appeared on the scene at the beginning of this century and hasn't really progressed much, but it still has about 10% of the world's trade and investment. The yen, a bit smaller, it's there as well, but hasn't really grown very much. And the renminbi. Well, now what frightens the US imperialism is that China, with its dramatic manufacturing and trade growth, could be a rival to US dollar imperialism over the next generation. And so, as we can see, they're determined to try and curb, restrict, and control Chinese economic expansion. And I don't really see the renminbi yet as being in any way in a position to rival the US dollar. So if we have a crisis in capitalism, it's going to be a crisis in capitalism, not specifically to do with the dollar. All you would say is that over the last 2 generations, US economy is still the biggest in the world. It's still the most important. It's still the biggest imperialist power, but relatively, in terms of manufacturing, and trade, and in investment, it has declined relatively. It's still the largest, but relatively it's declined relatively to Japan, to Europe, and of course to Asia, particularly China. That situation increases the worry and desperation of US ruling class. They still feel confident they're the biggest power in the world, but they now have to cooperate with other powers in the imperialist bloc, and they're now looking to control a dangerous rival in the 21st century. So I don't see a dollar crisis, but I do see an intense trade and investment war and technology war that's going to develop between the second great economic power in the world, now China, and US imperialism.
Okay, next up is Gulden, followed by Norma, Susan, and I think we've got to wrap it up. Then Raj, and I think that'll be it. We thank you for staying after today and answering extra questions. So Gulden, can you go ahead, followed by Norma, Susan, and then Raj.
Hi, Michael. I thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation. I was very impressed. My question is, I apologize if you mentioned this before, because I joined a little late. My question is, what do you think some of the countries like China are not impacted from the COVID crisis as much as US did? Is it better pandemic management or different economic structure or political approach? Or that's my question. Thank you.
It's a good question, Gulden. I did sort of briefly cover it, but I think it's all those things, really. First of all, pandemic management was, the virus started in China. It started in the food markets of China, as far as we can see. Thanks to Donald Trump, it was called the Wuhan virus, but it's now a global virus. It started there, and the Chinese weren't prepared for it. They didn't expect it. And for a while, they were struggling to deal with it. But very quickly, they introduced policies, containment policies, which have proved incredibly successful. Massive and drastic lockdown in Wuhan and anywhere else where there was an explosion, first of all. And the population of Wuhan went along with this on the whole. You might say that's because the Chinese population is very subservient to the Chinese state. But even so, there's also a view that that's what you have to do to cooperate to solve this. That was the first thing. But also a massive expenditure on test and tracing and hospitalization facilities building of hospitals in a day and all that sort of thing went on in China to ensure that they could handle the explosion of infections and hospital cases. And they were able to crush that virus. They crushed it. And I think, how do they manage to have those facilities? Do you know that the death rate for the US now is over 1,000 per million? That's the death rate in the US. The death rate in China is 3. This is staggeringly, the comparison is just nowhere, considering it started in China. And that's partly the reasons I've described, also the social organization and the nature of the Chinese economy. This is a state-planned, state-controlled economy. If they want, the government decides it wants to shift resources in a certain direction, it can do so, even though it's a large private sector. It can do so through the state sector, but also directing the private sector to ensure that those things are achieved in terms of hospitals, in terms of medical equipment, in terms of testing and tracing. Who exports all the personal protective equipment and test things? They all come from China. China's been not only dealing with it at home, they've been exporting it to the rest of the world because we don't produce enough of it. Every day I sit here in London and a big, huge plane with NHS on it flies over. And when I check on the plane radar thing, it says it's come from Guangxi or Tingshan or something like that, flying into a port in the UK in order to deliver all the equipment that our private sector cannot make, cannot produce in sufficient quantities. So the state planning, state sector, plus the cooperation with the population, plus the impact of applying drastic lockdowns succeeded in China. And now that economy is growing again. And in fact, most of the economy is now completely open and running as normal before, while we in Europe and you in the US are still struggling in this nightmare of waiting to get a vaccination before we all get ill.
Okay, next up is Norma, followed
Hi.
by
Yeah,
Susan,
I'll
followed
speak.
by Raj. Go ahead. Go ahead. Mhm.
Hi, thank you for that well-respected presentation, respected by you and the rest of us, I'm sure. I'm glad to hear the mention of tobacco and of space travel. The tobacco, of course, destructive in order to produce it, let alone what it does. I'm not sure what it does to the land, but I doubt that it enriches the land or preserves it in any kind of way. But the same about space travel being a diversionary behavior that is just confusing our, I hate to use the same word, but I'm slow to think, confusing our idiots to think that there is merit other than perhaps, holding on to a piece of moon and saying what's in it. It has no value to human beings as a behavior for our future, as it were. That's what's being put out there. The big thing is we, the intelligentsia, have to be able to talk with our fellows and say, what you want is that when they give you a 10% per hour raise, you notice that milk has gone up 10% as a cost. There's no such thing as a raise, and never was. It was a pretense. And in some cases, of course, it made people better off. But raised wages do not lead to significant benefits. They certainly don't lead to security. The evidence is all around us. And our job is to talk about, to affirm with people that what they really want is the communist construct. They want us to be able all to provide for ourselves and each other in meaningful ways instead of serving the profit of our 1%, they call them. We have to learn how to intercede as much as possible and say the same thing over and over again. And what we're looking for is subsidy. We're looking for that we seek the government to do that indebtedness, through the deficit, to subsidize our positive activities like the growth of local farms that are the alternative to people not having land, not being able to raise. People have to get, it's hard to talk about it all. People have to get that labor intensive work is good. The 8-hour day is not. Having lots of people go to a place to do things, a nearby place to do things.
3 minutes, Norma, go ahead. Ask your question or wrap up.
Thank you, yeah. Well, I'm repeating myself in a way, but I'm extending what I'm saying, and that is, we have to preach that people want what we all want, and that they're right to think so, and to dig it out with them, and to back it up, of course, by our struggles, and call it that when we're asking for wage raises, we're not asking for actual assistance.
Any comment, Michael? Anything?
Well, just on the space travel thing, I think there's lots of things that governments military spending is hugely wasteful, unproductive, and destructive, not only to human life, but wasteful in the sense that it's producing things that we can't use socially and so on. But out of military spending, in many wars, comes technological advance as an indirect result of the huge amounts of money spent by military spending to produce technological advances, whether it's on the internet and so on and other things. That's not the best way to get these technological advances. We should use the public resources we have directly to be aimed at social need and meeting the things that we need in the course of planning. But indirectly, things like military expenditure produce some technical advances which are used after the Second World War and so on. Space travel may or may not be something that we should do if we were a socialist economy. There are reasons possibly for developing space travel alongside all the other social needs that we have, and they may well produce some technological advances which we can use in the social economy as well. So it's not a black and white question, it seems to me. But the important question is that we don't control these decisions at the moment. These decisions are made by the ruling elite about how much to spend in Congress on military spending, and how much to spend on space, and how much to spend on public health, and how much to spend on education and so on. These decisions are basically in the hands of the ruling elites through Congress and through big business, and not through the democratic decisions of the people, apart from their one vote every 4 years, which they may not even get them registered on.
Right, and let us think of subsidizing the stuff that's good for us. As I say, taking it out of the
market.
What do you call? I lost the word. The debt. It's safe to take it out of the debt, because, as you say, it'll come out of the people that have money. Come out of their pockets.
Susan, and then Raj, and then we'll wrap it up. Susan.
Okay. Michael, could you talk a bit about the situation of labor movement in Great Britain and Europe?
Yeah, sure, Susan. I'm glad that these questions don't require more than a whole new session. So I'll have to answer this question in 30 seconds if I can. What's the state of the labour movement in Britain? Well, of course, and in Europe, as you know, historically, there's been a difference between the situation in the US and Europe. In Europe, we hadn't just developed trade unions like you did also in the US, but we also developed parties based on the trade unions, all with a socialist perspective during the late 19th century and into the 20th century, which became not only parties of opposition to the main party of the capitalist class, but also parties of government at periods of time in which they assumed office in various parts of Europe. And of course, as we speak now, there are governments in Europe that claim to be socialist or social democratic, often in alliance with the unions, which have prime ministers and run cabinets and so on. But of course, the result, as we know, these social democratic governments carry out policies which are basically the same as the main capitalist party It's like swapping as you get between Democrats and Republicans now. Until recently, now you've got Republican Party, which is so mad, it's difficult quite to see the Tweedledum, Tweedledee anymore. But in Europe, we have the position, particularly since the 1980s, where the social democratic governments followed neoliberal policies of austerity and so on in exactly the way as the openly capitalist parties did. But that's a political difference which existed, but in practice, it hasn't made much difference to the ability of the labor movement to change society permanently. It is true that in Europe, historically, because of the development of the labor movement politically, we were able to develop a bit more of a welfare state than you've got in the US in terms of pensions, social security. Most health systems in Europe are publicly owned, or at least the majority of it is. Education is state. Yes, we have private sectors in all of these now, I'm afraid, just like you do, but they're not the dominant part, so it is slightly different in Europe. But when we get down to the labor movement itself, I have to say that the situation of the trade unions in Britain is dire. Whereas back in the 1970s, when I was a young gambling man, trade unions were 40% of the workforce, and in some industries much bigger. In Sweden and Norway and places like that, it was 80, 90%. Now, the British trade union movement has no more than 15% of the workforce. It's not much better than the US trade union movement. And of course, in key private sector industries where it really matters to new industries, it's got little or nothing. Most of the trade unions composition is in the public sector, in teaching, health service, and so on, where very important, but they're not in a position to really threaten the capitalist class with strikes that are effective. So the situation is very similar on the trade union front, and more or less on the political front. Just like you, you had a Democratic Party which fought between a pro-capitalist wing and you might say a more radical wing under Bernie and so on. We had a similar position in the British Labour Party, which actually led to the leadership of the party coming under the control of the left, the socialist left too, the Corbynites as they like to be called. And so we saw a significant transformation. By the way, what that led to was that the British Labour Party, which had 150,000 members in 2015, in a country of 55 million, jumped to 650,000 members under the leadership of the left, with a massive increase of young people coming in, to be the biggest Labour or Socialist party in Europe. Of course, we've seen, unfortunately, a tragic setback for that left that has lost control to the old social democratic right wing at the moment, and the party's membership is declining as a result. Across Europe, we've seen similar developments where the old social democratic right was removed in parties and replaced by a radical left for a while, but it's ebbs and flows. I would sum up by saying, this is a whole separate discussion, as you know, that basically the Labour movement is more or less in the same situation in terms of its strength and its ability to fight, its confidence and its understanding of what to do as the American Labour movement, more or less. I have to say it's not much better, even though we do have political parties that supposedly represent the Labour movement.
Okay, last question, Raj, then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead, Raj.
I think we should have another session with Michael, because my next question requires more than an hour. I just wanted to say that we're at this stage of another collapse or really degradation of capitalism. So just like Lenin figured out a way 100 years ago to find a way for next set of socialist revolutions, I think there has to be that kind of look at our situation right now. But this is too big a question to pose to you for now. So maybe we will get a chance to talk to you again soon. Thank you very much for your...
Well, Raj, just two points on that. The objective conditions, we must analyze the objective conditions. What do we mean by that? I mean, what's happening to the economy? What's happening to capitalist profitability? What's happening to capitalism in general? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? That's the first thing. We must continually analyze that so we know what stage we're in, as to say. And then secondly, we must look at what the engagements, a program, an approach within the labour movement, a strategy which would help to raise the level of the labour movement, take it forward and succeed in making some progress against capitalism. Those two, so it's the subjective factor as well. So first of all, we need to know about the objective conditions. This is what my presentations are about. This is what my blog is about. It's about the objective conditions. Every day when I write a blog post, somebody in the comments says, well, thank you very much, Michael, but how are we going to overthrow capitalism? What's your strategy? Well, my reply to that is, well, my blog isn't about that. It's about the objective conditions. Sorry, I'm probably no better than you at answering your question about the subjective conditions and what to do. I do my best, like the rest of us do, to work out a program and a strategy. But the blog and my approach is to deal with the economic foundations, the social foundations, the objective conditions. We can't have one without the other. You can't change society without a strategy to change it. But it's no good having a strategy if capitalism's doing great and we don't know what's going on. We have to know both.
Okay, thank you.
On that note, I just have a quick reminder. I just want to remind everybody, please go to our website, sign up for our list if you're not already on it. Next week's presentation is going to be really important, very, very interesting on the farmers movement in India. And I just want to also say that this will be posted on YouTube within a day or two for people to view at their leisure. I think, Michael, on your Facebook page, you're going to post your slides.
Yeah.
And that is great. And I just want to say thank you so very, very much for your presentation. I think it was incredibly informative. Your expertise and your insights are just invaluable. And this was one of the most energetically, the longest number of participants in a session we've had in a long time. So we've run a half hour over. We still have a pretty big chunk of people that have hung on to watch. So thank you, Michael. We'd love to have you back again soon. And everybody go to his website, thenextrecession.wordpress.com, sign up, the best economics website on the web.
And have a look at the Facebook, and thank you very much for the questions. My Facebook site has something every day for you to read if you haven't been following that. And there's quite a lot of YouTube presentations I've got on my YouTube channel as well. So I'll just plug that as well. But thank you so much for all the questions. They were fantastic questions. Can't answer them all. And as you say, let's progress. And for God's sake, keep safe so that we can do this again.
Let's get rid of this monster system. Thank you very much.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me marxist.org/NPML. For information, write to NPML at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.